Hello and welcome to We Are Human. This podcast is brought to you by the Pro-Life Campaign in Ireland, and I'm your host, Wendy Grace. Coming up on this month's podcast, we're going to be reflecting on 2023. Very shortly, I'm going to be joined by Sarah Dowling, and we're going to be going beyond the headlines, looking back at some of the biggest pro-life stories of 2023. We'll also look back on some of our interviews from our webinar series, focusing on issues like euthanasia as well as the pro-life issue. And as always, I'll be giving you your courageous communication tip. But first, it's time for Fantastic Facts. And this month, we are focusing on the baby's development at 21 weeks gestation. I have to say, every time that I do this slot, I'm continuing to be fascinated by just the more that we're learning about the baby's development. Even though I've been through 3 pregnancies, I'm still in awe of the things that I forget and continue to learn. And one of the things that's happening at this time is that the baby is truly one of a kind. Well, of course, it's one of a kind from the very beginning, but the baby is now developing fingerprints. These are unique to us. No other person has the same fingerprints as you. And I think it's just one of those facts that shows us the unique nature of each and every person from the moment of conception. One of the other things that's happening is the baby is getting this kind of protective insulation. It's nerve protection, really, and it's forming around the babies to be nerves. And this keeps going actually until your baby's first birthday. For me, this is one of those parts of the baby's development that just shows us what's happening while the baby's growing in the womb. Continues, of course, to happen once the baby is born. What's also incredible at 21 weeks gestation is if you're having a boy or a girl, for a girl, the fallopian tubes, the uterus, they're all in position. And if you're having a boy, well, the mum might be able to tell at the next ultrasound. So at this point, the baby is about the size of your fist or a boneless chicken breast if you're making one for dinner. And at this time, the mum-to-be might be able to feel the baby kicking, twisting, rolling, maybe even a punch or two as well. And it's fascinating to see 3D and 4D ultrasounds. You can see all of this happening. And the baby's also practicing for so many things that they'll be doing a lot of once they're born. And they're yawning. That's the cutest thing ever, to see a baby yawning on an ultrasound, and hiccuping too. So as always with Fantastic Facts, share it at your next conversation. You know, babies have unique fingerprints at just 21 weeks. It's only by doing this that we can really just get people to know and learn about the true humanity of the unborn baby. So now it's time to go beyond the headlines. So this is the part of the podcast where we bring you stories that are often underreported or just totally ignored by the mainstream media. And to help me do this, because there's so much to cover from 2023, I have Sarah Dowling with us today. And Sarah, we're going to be just talking a little bit about all that's been happening in 2023. One of the things that we wanted to talk about today was the fact that there's been these committee hearings on euthanasia that's been happening. So here in Ireland, we have the Oireachtas health committees. They focus on different issues. One of them at the moment is looking at the issue of assisted suicide. So what's been happening, for people who don't know, is over the past number of weeks, there's been different themes at these committee hearings, and there's been various experts and some people just telling their own stories on this issue, kind of on both sides. What have you made of what you've seen so far?
It's really interesting to see the turn of events in Ireland in terms of, well, firstly with the abortion law, and then these euthanasia laws being put into place and things like that. Because I'm from Canada. Now I'm feeling a bit more Irish these days because I've been living here for quite a few years now. But even just looking at how Canada is, you just tend to notice that it's quite a slippery slope in terms of what
can happen. And actually, that one of the committee hearings was solely focused on the experience of Canada, because there's very few countries in the world that have actually legalised assisted suicide.
Yeah.
And, you know, there were several kind of experts from Canada saying, look, safeguards don't work. Here's what's happened. Give us an example of just some of the experiences of Canadians in terms of this issue.
Yeah, so Canada is now officially one of the leading assisted suicides capitals of the world, really.
Yeah, when I was watching the committee hearings and various different experts just coming from the Canadian experience, it was quite scary to just hear some of the horror stories. You know, one example was given of a Canadian veteran who, she was in a wheelchair. She wanted a wheelchair ramp installed in her house, and basically the answer was, no, we can't do that, but we'll give you assisted suicide. And also how just here in Ireland, assisted suicide is being framed as something for, you know, someone who has a terminal illness, for example, but we see from nearly every place that has assisted suicide that it really becomes based on subjective suffering, whether it's mental health issues, whether it's a physical issue, whether it's an intertwined version of both. Do you think that we're going to learn the lessons from Canada from just what we've heard at these hearings?
Well, I hope so, because it's just opened up, like it's year on year, more deaths per year are now being attributed to assisted dying. And like you said, you're going to your medical professional and you're saying to them, I'm depressed even, and as of next year, they're looking to even widen that even more. It used to, obviously, it was first introduced as a form of, helping those who are terminally ill and struggling. And now it's just, like I've said, it's a slippery slope because they've opened that up completely. And it's now become, as of next year, they want to be introducing it for people who, like I said, could either be just depressed or, have some sort of mental illness.
I know one of the things, and there was, we'll go to some of the clips of some of the experts shortly, but that was the thing that was coming across is it is a person's subjective judgment, or indeed a value judgment from somebody else. We're going to see a clip now of Dr. Miriam Colleran, and she was just warning about what happens when euthanasia and assisted suicide are legalised, and she was speaking at the Hope Ireland conference recently. Hope Ireland is a group of medical professionals that are opposed to assisted suicide. So have a look at what she had to say.
What we see happening in other countries that have actually already introduced forms of assisted suicide, whether it was assisted suicide or euthanasia, what happens in practice is that it's introduced for a section of society. So a section of society, typically persons who have terminal illnesses, are considered different. They're considered different and they're being treated differently. So actually when it's introduced, it's a form of discrimination towards them and othering of them, saying that different rules apply to these people. But once it's legalized, it becomes discrimination towards others, that it is legal for a certain part of society and not others. So that's really important. Once the door is opened, there's no stopping.
Yeah, I think it's very clear there from Dr. Colleran's clip, and she also addressed the Oireachtas healthcare committees as well. And let's remember, this is somebody who is working day in, day out in this area. And what was coming across so much from her and from so many other medics was that really their main concern, this wasn't some sort of like moral finger wagging. It really was, this is not good for the care of my patients. And on the one hand, you had this issue framed as, an autonomous choice. But what was coming across so strongly was this is something that affects the whole of society and the whole of patient care.
Absolutely. And this is what it is. And this is how it looks in Canada as well, is like people are going to their doctors and they're telling them that they're struggling with something. And it's like, well, here, I have a solution. Do you need assistance in dying? And it's like, instead of actually looking at the root of the problems of why people are struggling and just giving them the genuine, absolute care that they need. And they're calling it compassion, but it's not, because you're not getting to the root of the problem. And so many people have gone to their doctors and said, can you help with this? And then being offered this, they're very shocked. They're like, but I just need somebody to talk to, or I just need, like you said, a ramp in my house. I just need some sort of practical way to help me get through this. This is a season in my life. And instead they're like, no, this is what's for you.
It's where, and again, this is something that came across from many of the different speakers at the Oireachtas healthcare committees, where it is not a choice to die, but it becomes a burden to die, where people feel particular pressure to, as Dr. Siobhan McHale said, she's a psychiatrist and she was representing the Irish College of Psychiatrists, who have a very clear position statement on this, that they are opposed to it. And her point was, it'll be a choice not to die by assisted suicide, because all of a sudden this is on the table. Where you have this suite of options, and assisted suicide is one of them, and you have to choose not to do this. There was, Professor Siobhan McHale, we might hear a little bit of her contribution at the Oireachtas Healthcare Committee.
With regard to the question of whether one person's choice of assisted dying will have an impact on another who does not so choose, we would say the introduction of assisted dying legislation means that every person has to then choose it as a potential option or not for their end-of-life care. No person is an island.
I think what was really interesting by Dr. Siobhan McHale and Dr. Eric Callagher, who were both there from the College of Psychiatrists, was one of their points was, we actually need to be working on improving patient care, and this is going to totally undermine that. But from a psychiatric perspective, they were basically saying you can't actually differentiate between patients who are having suicidal feelings and patients who request assisted dying. And they were just trying to impress upon people the potential for assisted dying to undermine the fundamental principle that suicide is preventable. In other words, this fear that we have done so much in this country, we have a long way to go with suicide prevention, because for such a long time, it's been a massive issue and so much work is being done. So, we could have this bizarre situation where on the one hand, the government is promoting mental health and telling people their lives are valuable with these suicide prevention messages. And on the other hand, they'll be writing into law that suicide is okay in these circumstances where your life is of less value.
It just doesn't make sense. It's very contradictory.
It's one of those things that what message does it send? Interestingly, from a journalist perspective, when they were doing the particular focus on this committee where they were talking about suicide, there was a note to us saying how you report on this issue can have a negative impact if you use the wrong language. So we know, even when it comes to a headline I might write or how I speak about this on a podcast or on the radio, can affect a vulnerable person. Yet we're talking about, putting into Irish law circumstances where we say, well, your life isn't as valued. And I thought it was extremely powerful when Professor Des O'Neill, and he is a expert in geriatric medicine, and he was pointing to a piece in the Lancet. It's probably one of the best known journals in the world, where it talks about enabling doctors to care, not that carers don't become killers. Now, people had a problem with that language. Gino Kenny got pretty upset when this was brought in, because sometimes we want to sanitize the debate that we're talking about. Have a look, I should say, at Professor Des O'Neill and his contribution at the Oireachtas Committee.
Just to Professor O'Neill, Professor O'Neill, I think some of the language that you use in your statement is very regretful. Very regretful in relation to the word killing, eugenics.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of aside and kind of going down the road that I don't think we should go down. But look, I can't stop, people that come into this committee or outside the committee using terminology that is offensive to those that are trying to have a reasonable debate about assisted dying.
What we see is what we call normative conformity, where we begin to see standards slip around providing adequate and appropriate care. Again, you heard some of this from New Zealand yesterday. And what happens is people feel, well, it's there and somebody should be doing it. And I think what happens is then we see slippage in terms of providing appropriate care. And in terms of the language I use, I suppose they are the language that are used in the ethics literature. And I think what we need to bring to this arena is an informed debate where we use the language that is common and procedurally used. And I think when we hear words that the language is offensive, certainly in debating in other circles, we're concerned that people are trying to stifle what is the actual language of ethics journals, ethics research, and positioning as it is. And if the Lancet talks about preventing, a Lancet which is a broad-based general journal, one of the top journals in the world, talks about preventing healers from becoming killers, I think that is what it is, Deputy Kenny.
So, Sarah, we have spent a lot of time just reading all the transcripts of these committee hearings, looking at the contributions, and we've seen some of them today of different professionals. You know what? I know for people that are listening or watching, it is really difficult. And as we're talking about the issue of assisted suicide, we will hear really difficult stories. And that's kind of what's put front and centre, is these difficult, emotional stories. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, you have the overwhelming majority of medics, as I said, palliative care consultants, geriatric specialists saying this is not good for patients, not good for society as a whole, saying don't do this in Ireland. But I couldn't help but think, as we heard examples from other countries where they're showing in places like Holland, the Netherlands, soon to be Canada, where essentially mental health difficulties are a perfectly fine reason for giving somebody assisted suicide. I mean, anybody who's listening or watching that has been to, for example, something like a Darkness into Light walk that Pieta House runs, you walk alongside people at an event like that, every one of those people has a story of how suicide has torn their lives apart. Every one of those people has a story of how families have been devastated, communities have been devastated. And when you look at some of the root causes that might have led that individual in that person's life to take their own life, things like social isolation, mental distress, most people would say that's devastating because there's something we can do about it. Yet this is exactly what's happening in countries where they have legalized assisted suicide, that these are the very reasons that people are able to avail of it. And I think they are the dots that people need to join. You can't on the one hand say suicide is upsetting and preventable, and we're going to put societal efforts to try and prevent it, and then on the other hand say, but in other circumstances we will give it support and protection of law.
Yeah, absolutely. I think anybody says, who's experienced any type of suicide in their family or whatever it may be, you always think of that as a tragic thing. You always think of that as something as this is not right. Like, what could we have done to prevent this? What could we have done to help this person in this situation? And more often than not, especially when it comes to mental illness or addiction of any type, it's that they needed somebody there to guide them and to help them through, to be there for them mentally, physically, emotionally. That's all they need. And people go through seasons in life, and that's not going to change,
And that was something that some of those who were working in the area of psychiatric care for those with terminal illness were talking about, that very natural human response of having suicidal thoughts after diagnosis, but then the stories of hope of working through that and having quality of life. And the danger here is that part two, that will never be reached if a law like this is introduced.
And how grateful people are. They're the glory stories of them actually getting through that dark time and going, I'm so glad that I didn't go down that route. But then to have a medical professional tell you this is how it's going to be for you, like, it's either you're going to spend loads of money because you're going to have to go to, in Canada, a lot of people, there's been so many stories of people having to go across the border for life-saving surgeries. And why? It's because they were told they're going to be on a waiting list until they die, or they can just go on the assisted dying wait list, but they're not going to be seen by a doctor, and the only other option is basically end your life. And that's not good enough.
Well, we've just touched on some of what was brought in at the Oireachtas Healthcare Committees. I would urge you to, you can watch back any of the hearings. If you don't have the time to do that, you can read the transcripts, you can speed read them, look for those who you're interested in hearing their contributions on the Oireachtas website. I recommend also going onto the Hope Ireland website, some really good resources on there, and just elaborating on some of what we've talked about today. I wanted to move on now to another big story from 2023. This is about telemedical abortion is continuing in Ireland. So for those who don't know what telemedical abortion is, this was something that was introduced during the COVID-19 pandemic, whereby a woman wouldn't have to see a doctor. It would be exactly what I said, telemedical, on the phone or a kind of Zoom style setup in order to obtain the abortion pills. And at the time that it was introduced, it was during a pandemic. The then Minister for Health at the time, who was Simon Harris, he basically said, he said there wouldn't be telemedical abortions in 2018. This is during the referendum. Then we have this pandemic, it's brought in, we're told it's only a temporary measure, and yet here we are, 2023, where they're kind of...
I feel like that's a bit of a sneaky way of kind of opening that door, don't you think?
Yeah.
Because now it's available, and it's almost like it's like it is in the UK, same thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and the scary thing is that in a parliamentary response to Deputy Carol Nolan, the HSE basically acknowledged that, by a woman having a telemedical appointment compared to a woman sitting in front of a doctor, that they might miss things like coerced abortion, because obviously if a patient is sitting in front of you, you might be able to tell. You don't know if I'm on the phone to a doctor, is there partner, husband, family member beside me? squeezing my arm to make the phone call.
Yeah, and this is another factor as well. How are you supposed to really know how far along the person is as well, right? Because that's a huge one as well. They could be telling you that they're a certain amount of weeks gestation, but turns out they're a little bit more. But they're just from that 1 or 2 phone consultations, they're sending those pills out.
Sadly, we have seen circumstances in other countries where women have died taking these particular pills. And in this last year, there was 2 tragic cases that we know of, as in that were reported on other media outlets. A woman in Nevada in the United States, another in Canada, who died of sepsis having taken these abortion pills. For me as a journalist, the hypocrisy of journalists who talk about, misinformation and disinformation, and yet here we have 2 women who've died from sepsis. Now, sepsis is what Savita Halappanavar died of in Ireland, and her case was used to push abortion. But these cases of these women's deaths, because they can't push abortion, they highlight the dangers of it for women, they're just covered up.
They're absolutely cherry picking these type of stories.
So I guess that's what when we're talking to people about this, we're trying to have conversations, right? So it's, asking the question, what do you think about the women that have died? Or what do you think about the dangers that it poses? And asking people to think about, I would say most people don't really know that this is happening, telemedical abortion, but also it's about holding the government to account. The government who said this isn't going to continue, this isn't going to keep happening. That kind of brings me on to one of the other big stories of 2023. It's something, Sarah, that, for those of us who were campaigning against abortion, it's kind of like our worst nightmares come true. Because at the time we said, look at every country where abortion is introduced. The figures grow and grow and grow, sadly. But it's actually skyrocketed, I think, even more than we ever could have anticipated. It looks like in 2023, we're going to have close to something like 9,000 abortions. Pre-legislation, it was kind of average between 3,000 or 4,000. So in such a short space of time. And politicians are just burying their heads in the sand. I mean, whatever you feel on the abortion issue, surely there should be some desire to want to understand, what is the reason? What is the root cause that is driving these figures up so drastically, so quickly? But it just seems to be turn a blind eye, nothing to see here, and not really wanting to explore the challenges that women are facing when they have an unplanned pregnancy.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things as well, I think that would frustrate people is that it's our taxpayer money that's funding this. 46 million euros spent on abortion. Do you know how much was spent on providing positive alternatives?
Zero.
And I think, again, for people who are watching or listening, you don't have to wave a pro-life flag or even say I'm a pro-life person to go, do you know what? 46 million euro of taxpayers' money being spent on this and nothing being spent on positive alternatives. See, positive alternatives isn't stopping what's happening. Abortions will still happen. But at least some right now, it's just all roads lead to abortion. And when we've kind of, naturally enough, the majority of people, when you say, hey, do you think women should be given positive supports? Of course they say yes.
89% of people agree with even the option of giving women alternative options to abortion. And a lot of women would choose life if there were better options, or they even knew about their options, and that there are supports in place for them that they can avail of.
And that's what I don't get. If you want to call yourself pro-choice and I say to you, okay, well, if you want to say pro-choice, why can't we then say you have this and this support in place? I mean, I've seen people who call themselves pro-choice, arguing against pro-life groups that provide these supports for women.
Oh yeah, they're trying to block them at every turn, and it's just so hypocritical, isn't it? Because if you are so pro-choice, why can't you be pro a woman choosing life, and then supporting the organizations that support women in those crisis situations and help them through it and help them realize that it's not the end of their life, it's not the end of their career, and they will be okay.
Yeah, and also just that thing of, well, isn't it heartbreaking to think of, a woman who says, do you know what, if only I had access to childcare, if only I had this support, things that we can do,
exactly,
but that we're not.
Yeah, and then you think about the back to the taxpayers' money. It's like 46 million euro on abortion provision. Like, that is unbelievable. That's an unbelievable number. And you think, like you said, you think about how much how much of that taxpayer money could have been spent on providing alternative options and supporting the non-profit organisations that give women the support they need to continue with their pregnancies.
And that's before you even go into just even purely from a socio-economic perspective. I cannot get how the government doesn't go, hey, like Ireland has one of the oldest populations in Europe. We're actually barely at replacement level. And there's perhaps women out there who would love to continue with their pregnancy, but we're not supporting them. Why? So anything we should be encouraging and supporting women to continue with their pregnancies. One of the other things that I think we need to talk about here is when we look at supports for women, a good news story, but one that should be used to say, hey, let's invest in pregnancy supports. And that's coming from Texas. And they have just really compelling evidence that they are saving 1,000 babies' lives and helping 1,000 women each and every month, because this is a direct result of the change in the law there following the overturning of Roe versus Wade. But it's two-pronged. It's not just about the law changing. It's about actually providing alternatives. So they have implemented the Alternatives to Abortion program. And that's been run in Texas. And basically, it's what we're talking about. It's what we wish the Irish government would do. It's life-affirming alternatives to abortion. And really, it's how can we help women? How can we help them carry their babies? And they have received state funding.
Wow, and you're seeing the practical results of that, because
It's
they're
a no-brainer.
saving lives. And I'm sure if you speak to the mothers of those, not only are they happy that they continue with their pregnancy, but that there was that support in place for them when they needed it.
Yeah, they're putting the money into it. I believe for 2024, they're going to invest 140 million for this particular program. And the Texas Health and Human Services Commission has confirmed the collapse in the number of abortions taking place in the state, and local pro-life counselling services are speaking about their first-hand experience of dealing with just the numbers of women coming to them for support who are choosing to continue with their pregnancy because the support is there. If anything, and again, I keep going back to this, look, whatever you feel on the issue, why would it be a negative thing if we can say, look, when we invest in supporting women, they're enabled, empowered further to choose life? Even looking at this evidence from Texas, that's the type of thing that might have been useful in this 3-year review. That's another big story of this year. So for people who haven't heard much about it, the 3-year review was a process that was undertaken by the government. It was meant to be a process that was very transparent. It has been anything but. Even the chair of the committee, that chair was kind of handpicked by the Minister for Health. That's not what we were promised originally. So it was chaired by Barrister Marie O'Shea. And even reading this review, the language that's used in it is the language of pro-abortion advocates, the type of terminology that they use. It's not written in kind of a neutral, factual way, I feel. But one of the things that was really telling, I'm going to show you a clip of it now, is we had Oireachtas Healthcare Committee hearings looking at the 3-year review, kind of interrogating it, analysing it, all that sort of stuff. And one of the kind of main headlines when this piece of work was published was abolish what's called the 3-day wait. I prefer to call it a 3-day period of reflection. It's giving a woman time to think, time to reflect. And yet the person who authored this report didn't even have her facts right on this, even though this was one of the things that she was advocating for.
Question that I would like to pose is there any other example anywhere in Ireland for any medical procedure, or as a matter of fact, anywhere in the world where there's a 3-day delay from your research and your medical knowledge?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
I mean, what do you make of that, Sarah? You have someone who is obviously an extremely intelligent, capable woman, tasked with putting together this report. And one of the most basic questions, and let's face it, one of the things that's being pushed the most is, getting rid of the 3-day period of reflection. Doesn't even know that there's waiting periods in other countries, some of them much longer than 3 days.
I couldn't believe it. All it takes is a quick Google search to know that almost all other countries have something similar in place, and like you said, something even longer than 3 days. I think in Germany it's 3 days.
Belgium is 6 days. Yeah, Italy there's a 7-day wait. So it just shows you, wow, here's a real lack of knowledge, and even trying for them to intellectually analyse and in their research, we know from the number of women who made first appointments and then not continued that there's thousands of women right now, holding a toddler's hand, cradling a babe in arms, that their babies are alive today because they had that time to think, and maybe in that time found the person who said you can do this, or found the support they needed. Exactly. And yet, when asked at the committee hearings, one of the other contributors was asked, why did you not interview any of these women? why did you not get the experience of women who continue with their pregnancy? The answer they gave was, I hate to use such a strong word, but it was kind of pathetic, because basically they were saying, oh, well, it would have been very traumatic. And it's like, hang on, didn't you talk to the women who had abortions? And I mean, for some women, that's an extremely traumatic experience that haunts them for the rest of their life. Not for all, but for some, for many. You didn't want to talk to women who continued with their pregnancy. I don't know about you, but I've never met a woman who's continued with a pregnancy that wasn't so happy that that's the route that they went down.
Absolutely. They're not going to stand there and go, oh, I'm traumatized with the fact that I have a
my
child
baby
right
in my
now.
arms.
I mean, motherhood is hard. That's a given, you know. But
this is a classic piece of research where they just did the research on what they wanted to hear, because guess what? If they sat down and talked to those women and they said, I'm so glad I didn't have an abortion, or I found this support, or I found that, it wouldn't have been the hymn sheet they wanted to sing off. And I think people should be concerned, even if this isn't kind of an issue that's on the top of someone's agenda, they should be concerned about the government conducting something in such a biased way that's really just trying to feed into their narrative, into what they're trying to push, which is essentially fast tracking as much abortion as they can have, without providing women alternatives. You know, that this, I guess it undermines our trust in other processes that the government are undertaking. I mean, where was the voices of women who, like we've talked about, continued with their pregnancy? Where was the experience of women, and there had to be some, okay, because this is something that's borne out in every single country in the world, who regretted their abortions and were struggling because of it? Why were they excluded from the research? Where was the women who were saying, I felt pressure, I felt coerced? Again, you can't just say Ireland is in some sort of magical bubble. Every single country in the world where abortion is available, women are saying, I have been pressured. Again, a certain percentage of women. Whereas the families that we're hearing from all the time saying, my baby was diagnosed with life-limiting illness or disability, and I felt pressure. No analysis of the fact that, for families who hear that their babies have Down syndrome and that diagnosis is given in the womb, it used to be about 50% of families went to the UK for an abortion. That figure has gone up to 95%. Yeah. I mean, that to me is devastating. Yeah. The fact that there's disability discrimination happening in the womb and no one seems to care.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, then they're flip-flopping, because it's all about equity, it's all about inclusion. But when it comes to, these people with disabilities in the womb, it's like, well, it's obviously just to terminate the pregnancy.
And then you see babies who survived late-term abortions published in research without any care, left to die alone. You see cases of misdiagnosis where there was no life-limiting condition and that baby's life was ended. Pretty harrowing stuff that just people aren't learning about. So look, I hope that perhaps you're hearing some of these stories for the first time, and it's up to us to share them with people and ask them, what do you think about this, or have you heard about this? And Sarah, listen, thanks for joining me for Beyond the Headlines, and it's been great to have you with us on We Are Human today.
Thank you.
So now we're going to take a look back at just some of the best bits of the Pro-Life Campaign webinars over the past year. And this first interview that I did was with Amrita Kerr, and she's just talking about her experience of taking the abortion reversal pill. And she bravely shared with us just her story and also a little bit about her incredible daughter. Have a look.
To me, it was like, oh, this must be rare, because no one gets into this situation. And two, I was panicking quite a lot, because in my mind it was like, my baby, I need to save her life. And then I got in contact with Dr. Emma, which told me about the progesterone pill. And then I took it the next day, and everything's been good since then. But my goal has been since then is to make sure people get enough, as much knowledge as possible about progesterone pill, and actually understand that they do have more than just one option in this situation, and they shouldn't just sit there and be like, oh, okay, well, I've made my mind up now, or I've swallowed that pill and that's it, it's done.
People will just find so heartbreaking is that, because obviously you were able to seek out the abortion reversal pill, and thank God it worked for you, and your little girl is alive and well today. She's 15 months old, I know. But it's interesting that you said, when you called back the abortion clinic, they're obviously used to this happening where there's regret. Many other women mightn't have known about the abortion reversal pill, but even the idea of obviously if there's a lot of women contacting the abortion clinics afterwards, is they obviously were not sure in their decision in the first place, but weren't given adequate information or counselling, or even asked that basic question, are you sure this is what you really want? Do you think that that's something that's really lacking?
I do, yes, I do. And I've actually thought recently, like past couple of months, of there should be a website that gives all this information, just like the fact. And I think with abortion pill, in my mind, and since having conversations about this with friends that never actually thought about it, or family that have never thought about what abortion actually means.
This next clip is with Uju Ekioka, and she's involved with Culture of Life Africa, and she just so powerfully speaks about the ideological colonisation. She's talking particularly about African nations, but I can't help but think when I hear Uju speak that this is something that's happening all over the world. Take a look.
All these things happening on the African continent with regards to abortion. In your parliament, somebody had raised a question asking about how much the Irish government had spent on abortion organizations. So they got the response from the foreign minister that they have actually in 2022 given money to International Planned Parenthood Federation, to the Clinton Foundation as well, for the work they're doing in Africa. And we know that these organizations are very much involved in abortion on the African continent, one way or the other. So that's part of what your government is doing. Whatever happens is for people to know, even if they are in support here in Ireland of abortion, just know that your tax money is going to some abortion organization to spread the ideology on the African continent. Is that really what you want? That is a question for the Irish people.
So now it's time for courageous communication, and this is the part of the podcast where I give you communication tips just to help you talk about the pro-life issue. And I wanted to talk to you about something. It's called the learning pyramid. So this is all about how we retain information, which is pretty hard to do because we are bombarded with messages, whether it's what we're seeing or hearing, what we're scrolling through on our phones. But how much of it can you retain? I mean, if I was asked you to name 10 news stories that you heard from today and tell me all about them, I'm pretty sure most of us wouldn't be able to do it, because that's not how our brains work. Because if we actually just hear something once, we're probably likely to remember about 5% of it. So if we're just listening to something, about 5% of it sticks in here. If you read something, you can retain about 10% to it. Now, if you listen to something and you read something, then it kind of jumps up a bit. You'll be able to remember more like 30%. But if you demonstrate your recall, then that figure goes up again to about 50% if you're going to discuss it as well. So being able to basically say, here, I can understand this issue because I've listened to it, I have read it, and now I'm able to discuss it. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is when we're having conversations is sometimes we wonder, well, what's the point? Well, there's a big difference for somebody who might see a pro-life message or hear a pro-life message to them actually discussing it with you. So really, this month's courageous communication tip is about encouraging you. Well, first of all, you have to arm yourself with the knowledge. You're the one who has to listen, who has to read, who has to demonstrate your knowledge. But in discussing it, you can take someone from being able to retain 5% of something that they might hear or see to 50%. And these are the pro-life seeds that we are planting that will be part of rebuilding a culture of life. So the next time you're kind of on the fence thinking, will I or won't I discuss this topic? You know, will I share at the dinner table? Wow, a baby has fingerprints at 21 weeks gestation. Or will I talk about 46 million euros of taxpayers' money being spent on abortion in Ireland? Remember that discussion, and we're talking about a discussion, we're not talking about an argument. I always talk about conversations, not confrontations. That discussion is going to make a massive difference in somebody's retention of the knowledge that you're giving them. So I'm encouraging you to have courage over this next little while to talk about some of the things that you've learned on the podcast today. Thank you so much for joining me on this month's We Are Human podcast. This podcast is brought to you by the Pro-Life Campaign in Ireland. I've been your host, Wendy Grace. Thank you so much as well earlier to Sarah Dowling, who joined me in studio. The best thing you can do now is to like and share and subscribe to the podcast on your preferred platform like Spotify. Or of course, you can watch us on YouTube. And come on, be kind, give us a 5-star review as well. I'll talk to you next month.